still. So my subject today is storytelling. Where it comes from and what it gives us. And the first story goes like this. There once was a young woman who went to her parents one day and said, "This business about everybody having to die, I don't like it." So she said goodbye to her parents and to her aunts and uncles and to all of her friends. And she set out on a journey to find the land where one never dies. For many days and many miles, she journeyed, asking everyone that she came across about this land where one never dies, but nobody had ever heard of it. She came to a mountain, and there at the bottom of the mountain was an old woman. She had hair to about her shoulders, and she was wheeling a cart, a wheelbarrow, full of rocks. And the little girl said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt your work, but I'm looking for the land where one never dies." And the woman turned to her and said, "I've never heard of the place, but stay here with me for as long as it takes me to wheel away this entire mountain, stone by stone. You will not die." And she said, "How long will that take?" And she said, 100 years. And the girl said, "What happens at the end of the 100 years?" And the old woman said, "Well, you'll die." And she said, "Goodbye. I'm looking for the land where one never dies." On she went. She came to a forest, trees as far as she could see. And there at the edge of the forest was another old woman, this one with hair down to her waist. And the old woman said, "No, but stay with me for as long as it takes for me to prune every single tree in this forest. You will not die." "How long will that take?" "Who can say? 200 years?" And she said goodbye and journeyed onward. She walked a long way until she eventually came to a sea. And there on the bank of the water was another old woman. And this one had hair all the way down to her ankles. Beside her there was a duck, and the duck was drinking from the sea. And she said, "I'm looking for the land where one never dies. Have you heard of it? Can you point me in the direction?" And she said, "No, but stay here with me. For as long as it takes that duck to drink this entire sea dry, you will not die." "What happens after the sea is dry? Do you really want to live this long? You'll die." And she said goodbye. Well, she was just about ready to give up her journey, thinking it might have been foolhardy all along, when off in the distance, as she turned a corner, she saw a mansion on a hill. She went over to the mansion. She knocked on the front door. No answer. She walked around to the back. No answer. And she was just about to get back on the road and head back for home when the door swung open, and there in the door, silhouetted, was the oldest woman she had ever seen. And this one had hair all the way down to the floor and billowing out behind like a robe or something. And the girl went up to the house and said, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm looking for the land where one never dies." And the old woman's eyes lit up, and she said, "You found it. Come with me. As long as you stay here with me in this place, you will not die." And so the young woman went into the house and lived there with that old woman for a long time, like a queen. But one morning, she came down to breakfast, and she said, "Thank you so much for your hospitality. I have loved living here. You are so kind to let me stay in this place where I will never die, but I miss my family." And the old woman looked at her and said, "They're long gone." And she said, "How much time has passed?" And the old woman said, "Who can say? Centuries." And she said, "Well, I'd at least like to go back and see my hometown, just one more time." And she said, "Does it even still exist?" But seeing that the young woman's curiosity and desire to go back home would not be sated, she said, "There is one way that you can do this. There's a horse in the barn that rides like the wind. Get on that horse, ride as fast as you can, back to your home. Do what you need to do. But whatever you do, do not get off of the horse. The second that your foot hits the ground, you will die. And she said, thank you, I'll do exactly as you say. And the next morning, she got ready, she went out to the barn, she got on the horse, and away she rode. She went back the same way that she had came, so she passed by the sea, only now there was no sea, just a little puddle. And there on the banks of what had once been the sea, there were two piles of bones, the old woman and the duck. And she thought to herself, I'm glad I did not stop here. She continued on, and there was what she thought must have been that forest, only it was just sort of branches blowing around in the wind. She came to the mountain, only there was no mountain anymore, just a field of gravel blowing in the wind as far as you could see. Eventually, she arrived back at her hometown. But when she got there, what the old woman had said turned out to be true. Her family was nowhere to be found. Nobody had ever heard of them. And she didn't really recognize even the house that she had grown up in. She turned back on the horse to head back to the mansion. And up ahead of her, on the side of the road, there was a cart full of shoes. And next to the cart, there was an old man. And this old man was trying to get the cart back up onto the road. It was stuck in some mud. And as she rode by on the horse, the old man called out to her and said, can you help me? My cart's stuck. I need to get it back up on the road. I could really use an extra pair of hands. And she said, I'm sorry, I'm under strict orders to go back home. I've got somewhere to be. I can't get off of my horse. And the old carter said, do you have no pity? I'm an old man. Can you please get off your horse and just help me? It will just take a moment. And moved by pity for the old carter, she stepped off the horse. And the second that her foot hit the ground, he grabbed her by the arm. And he said, do you know who I am? I am death. And do you see those shoes in my cart? Those are all the shoes I've worn out in pursuit of you. But now I have you in my grip. And so, the young woman had to die, just like everybody else. In a recent essay in the New Yorker magazine, the critic Parul Sehgal expressed a sentiment more and more resonant in our literary culture, maybe just culture more generally, that storytelling has run its course. Narrative exhaustion has set in. So ubiquitous, so universally deployed has it become by corporations and by colleges, by political strategists and by pastors, by podcasts and by conferences, and yes, by writers, that it's time to set it aside maybe and find new ways of relaying experience and information and wisdom. We are all, Sehgal writes in her essay, Scheherazade now. Segal's essay reminded me of an exchange between two of my friends on Twitter, two of my friends from Iowa City, back when it was still called Twitter. I hate the ahistorical, caveman around the campfire mysticism of the term storyteller, one of them, a magazine journalist, wrote, to which the other replied, this is basically why public radio has collapsed into a pool of Moth Radio Hour, TED Radio Hour, etc. The storytelling, all caps, ideology is in full effect. Point taken. It's true, right? We really are overwhelmed with stories. And it can be a little suffocating. It can be disorienting. I mean, if everything is narrative, narrative can't help but lose some of its power, some of its appeal, and some of its trustworthiness. And yet, for all the hazards that come with it, for all the ways stories can be and are often used and misused to manipulate our lives and sell us things we do not need, to crowd out other stories, especially the ones that we probably really do need, the truth is we can no more escape story, as that one that I opened with illustrates, than we can escape, well, death. What does that story, which comes from Verona and goes back many centuries, in which at some point was written down and then included in Italo Calvino's great anthology of Italian folk tales, as translated by George Martin. What does that story say? What is it about? Well, it's about mortality, of course, about how death is sure and certain and coming for all of us sooner or later, whatever our creative or desperate attempts at evasion or of delay, however much money we invest in life-expanding technology, it's still the case that one out of every one of us is going to die, and have done, and will continue to, so long as the old saints used to say, the Lord tarries. Hank Williams, at his most prophetic, put it like this: no matter how I struggle and strive, I'll never get out of this world alive. And yet that story is also about storytelling. That ancient and abiding human impulse and exchange. And what it tells us about stories is that in their essence, right at their core, they are made possible, indeed they are given their warrant, in effect, by death. Death, the end, the ebb, the imminent, the last note, the final page. Well, it creates pressure and urgency. It provides a frame, a measurable flow, not to mention an incentive. What we have, we will one day lose. So best to make a record while there's still a record to be made. Why do stories exist? Why do we feel the need to tell them and to hear them told? Because death exists, the story says. No death, no narrative. In short, no story. 2. The second story goes like this. Long ago in Kentucky, I, a boy, stood by a dirt road in first dark and heard the great geese hoot northward. I could not see them, there being no moon and the stars sparse. I heard them. I did not know what was happening in my heart. It was the season before the elderberry blooms. Therefore they were going north. The sound was passing northward. That's the first stanza of a poem by Robert Penn Warren, first published in 1969 when he was teaching at the University of Iowa, I should say, in the writer's workshop. It's the last in a lengthy sequence, perhaps the most beautiful set of verses that Penn Warren, who is the only American writer to win the Pulitzer Prize twice for poetry and fiction, ever wrote. And it's about the famous bird illustrator John James Audubon. Here at the end of that cycle, Penn Warren brings his biographical inquiry into Audubon home by rooting his interest in a brief yet expansive recollection from his childhood in Kentucky. And how does he do that? By telling a story. Now, I can't remember the first time I read those lines. We all have pieces of writing like that, they just resonate with us, and we can never not hear it. It's with us. It affirms something in us. It speaks to us. I can't remember when I first read them. But what I know is that, like certain songs by Billie Holiday and certain paintings by Alma Thomas, movies by Mia Hansen-Love, I've never stopped being moved by those lines. And I found myself reaching for them again and again in my own writing life, not to find comfort, not to feed nostalgia for a certain kind of rural idyll or transcendent experience of the natural world, but to be shaken out of stasis and a gnawing sort of cynicism about what storytelling is for and can do. But what kind of story is it that Penn Warren tells in that poem? If by story, what comes to mind is a legendary epic. For my students, this is what they think of when they think of story. It's Harry Potter, If what comes to mind is a fairy tale, a manipulative corporate marketing campaign, a conversion testimony, or a literary device used to foist meaning onto unrelated fragments, well, the story Penn Warren tells here doesn't measure up. It would almost seem to be an anti-story, I mean, there's not enough plot, right? Nothing really happens. Not enough characters. Not enough exposition. What does story mean in this poem? What kind of story does Penn Warren want to hear? Well, the second stanza of the poem is helpful. Tell me a story, he goes on, in this century and moment of mania. Tell me a story. Make it a story of great distances and starlight. The name of the story will be Time, but you must not pronounce its name. Tell me a story of deep delight. Death, this is the most time anybody has said death in a long time in this room, probably, but here we are. The Grim Reaper. Death creates stories. It necessitates them. In a death-haunted world, life takes the fraught, if inevitable, occasionally unsatisfying form of narrative. But here, Penn Warren argues that stories also help us live. They're like food. They're like water, but for the human heart. They are a means by which we survive and try to make sense of our experience as we do. They're the horse, as it were, upon which we briefly escape death's hold. What, according to Penn Warren, does a good story do? Well, for one, in that memorable line, it is an antidote to the private and public mania of the age, any age. In this century and moment, he writes, tell me a story. Now, it's not that stories bring perfect order out of chaos. The chaos of the world, the chaos of our lives. That's putting it far too simply. No story can do that. Rather, the desire, often felt in the midst of upheaval, to hear a story, testifies, I think, to the elusiveness of the reality in which we find ourselves, to how very difficult it is to discern what in the world it all means, while also testifying to our expectation, ever abiding, stubbornly enduring, whatever evidence to the contrary, that there will be meaning, must be some meaning. That by and by we will find something of good use to wring from our strange, tough, confounding experience. Second, Penn Warren writes, stories travel great distances and starlight. That's what he wants his stories to include. Stories, after all, remind us there's an elsewhere, that we're not the only ones, that the stars up in the sky shine on all God's creatures and have done for as long as we've been here, just as they did before we arrived. The writer Edward P. Jones says that a story is, quote, the record of a change. The record of a change. We're different in the end than when we started. Sometimes it's a relationship that changes. Sometimes it's a setting. At other times it's just our minds that have moved a half an inch. The boy in the first stanza of that Penn Warren poem, well, he's in the same physical spot at the end of the poem that he was when the poem began. And yet those geese, invisible, yet actual, hooting northward, well, their migration across a truly great distance has the effect of firming up that dirt road in his mind, turning it to marble, transforming that fleeting moment into a monument in his memory. You get the sense that what he hears there, senses there, but cannot see, has nevertheless transformed his perception altogether, has never stopped quickening by quieting his heart. Now, the great irony, of course, is that although we are inundated with stories, they're probably doing that. There's a group of students over there right now. They're probably all telling their story, right? Even though we're inundated with stories, we are more and more starved of them personally. Wonder if you feel that. When we put down our phones and turn off our TVs, when we find ourselves around a table or a campfire, on a road trip, or with pen in hand in front of an empty notebook page, just in the quiet of the night or early in the morning, are we possessed of stories? Or do we feel in those moments particularly our lack our need for them. And Warren says, slow down. Be still and know. Be attentive. You don't have to go searching. You don't need the budget of the Marvel universe. You don't need to have traveled the world or even to have lived to old age. You don't have to manufacture a thing. You just need your senses. You need some intuition. You just need some road, a small sliver of sky. Most importantly, a heart beating in your chest. Time, Penn Warren goes on, time with a capital T in the poem, is what in the long run this and every story will be called. That's essentially the book that we live in, the book of time. But for the time being, living as we do inside of time, in that developing story, under its rule instead of outside of it, beyond it, no need for it, we direct our attention to more particular narratives, to time's expression in the changing seasons, to the flowers that blow, to the direction the winds blow and the birds fly, and to the movement we feel in our own spirit in response. A third story. Growing up, I lived a quarter of a mile from my grandparents in the hills north of Nashville, Tennessee. On Friday nights, my grandmother, who's still alive, would fix a big supper, and then we'd sleep over and visit and work around the place on Saturday, mowing grass, stacking hay, watering animals, patching fences. When I was old enough, I was the oldest grandkid. When I was old enough to stay up with the adults after supper, a real privilege, I sat in the corner of the porch in a rocking chair, listening. In the woods around the porch, crickets and bullfrogs raised a wild ruckus. The winds wrestled in the tall trees. The world outside was dark and loud, frightening to a kid, and utterly oblivious to us. And yet there they were, all these people, alive and talking, as if their lives were worth talking about, in voices that had a resonance all out of proportion to their sound. What I remember when I think back to those moments is heaviness, intensity, a state of heightened alertness that made my mind reel and my face kind of ache. In silence, I would strain to hear every word, somehow jealous for the experience I was already having, out of time already while still in the thick of it. Later, I would read about how Chris Christopherson swept floors at Columbia Records just to catch glimpses of Cash and Dylan. About how Whitman put himself in the way of President Lincoln on the president's commutes to and from the White House. And I recognized something of their desperate commitment in my own dedication to those storytellers on that back porch. Well, one night, my younger cousins, Chad and Chase, who'd been sent off to bed after dinner with the little kids, came tugging at my shirt sleeve. They said they'd heard a coyote from their bedroom, and they were scared. I shooed them away, not wanting to have my revelry interrupted. And when they returned a few minutes later, I did the same thing again, telling them to grow up, pushing them back through the door. The third time, unrelenting, you know. The third time my uncle, their father, intercepted them before they could get to me. He knelt down to eye level. "What's wrong, boys?" he said. And they told him about the coyote. Now, I was sure that my uncle was going to tell them there was nothing to be worried about, and then send them back to bed, perhaps with a warning not to leave the room again. But instead, he asked them, dead seriously, to point in the direction that they heard the sound. And they were a little taken aback by this too. Tentatively, Chad pointed in the direction of the fruit trees out behind the house. "There," he said. And they nodded their yes. "Stay right here," my uncle said. He got up, turned for the screen door, and we watched. By this point, everybody had sort of caught on. We watched as my uncle walked across the driveway to his truck. where he pulled a rifle from a metal box in the bed and then walked out into the yard. Pow. He fired one shot and then another shot. The sound was absolutely deafening, but for its own echo, which rolled for a long time after that, over the din of the night. And he placed the gun back in the truck and returned to the porch, came right up to my cousins and said, "That coyote won't be bothering you no more, boys. Now go off to bed." And then he turned to me and said, "And you too." And I fell asleep that night, looking at the lit porch through the window, thinking about the stories I wasn't hearing because of my little scaredy cat cousins who lay in the bed beside me, already asleep. The next morning, greatest smell in the world, bacon. My grandmother's fixing breakfast. I get up, get my clothes on, walk in there, trying to sneak a little food before everybody sits down. And she says, "If you would, go out to the fruit trees and get a bunch of pears. I want to fry them for breakfast." So I grabbed a bucket from the garage and I headed out into the yard. And I'm picking up pears, grabbing some from low-hanging branches, the ones on the ground, throwing others out to the horses behind their house. And my bucket was about halfway full when I began to smell something truly awful in the fruit trees. And the farther I walked, the stronger the stench became. And finally, at the base of one of their apple trees, one of those low apple trees that you can climb up into, I saw a clump of grizzled fur. Put the bucket down, stepped up into the tree. And there, on that branch in that apple tree, was a coyote, shot through the side, dead. I'd never run faster in my life. I jumped out of that tree, left the bucket there, and burst into the kitchen. And when my grandmother asked about the pears in disbelief, I said, "Man, you will not believe." In that Penn Warren poem, there's one more thing that he calls for in the very last line. "Tell me a story," he concludes, "of deep delight." Delight, as it turns out, is a word that recurs very frequently in Robert Penn Warren's work. "Out of silence walks delight," he writes elsewhere. Delight comes on soundless foot into the silence of night, or into broad daylight. Delight comes like surprise. He goes on, "I have met delight at dawncrest. I have met delight at dovefall, when sunset reddens the dove's breast. I may not divulge the rest, nor may it be guessed." In this conception of delight, surprise is central. Surprise and mystery. It's less about pleasure, I think. It has little to do with merriment. It's closer to joy, with all of joy's unpredictability, even agony, with its undercurrent of sorrow. How joy humbles us by exposing our assumptions and vulnerabilities and leaves us prone and in awe, which is to say with a truer sense of reality. Delight, it evinces a wonder that life in this death-certain world would not seem to have given us, but which by and by stories preserve and make shareable. The heartfelt hopes once exemplified in Hollywood stories have now become obsolete and belong to another epoch. John Berger writes, "Hope today is a contraband, passed from hand to hand and from story to story." When I tell that story about the coyote, I feel like that girl who's just stepped off the cart, stepped off the horse, and feels death's surprising grip. Reeling, can you imagine? But also braced at the same time. I feel something like the young poet as well, posted up by that dirt road, looking up, not sure what's happening in his heart. That was the first story of my own I ever remember telling. And the fact was not lost on me that if my uncle had done what I wanted him to do, I wouldn't have had anything to say. What's the most surprising thing about it? Of that, I'm still not sure. The sight of a dead coyote in an apple tree, come on, that's surprising. Or a gruff uncle's unexpected tenderness towards his sons. Or maybe the fact that I'd be standing in front of you, telling that story, hoping against hope that between now and whenever the old Carter takes you by the arm and leads you on to your eternal home, in our very own century and moment of mania, you'll tell and retell and write maybe, and in any case take deep delight in some stories of your own. Thank you.
Well, Drew, I promised you more John Bratcher, so here we go. In one of his essays, it's actually about the Hieronymus Bosch triptych, Garden of Earthly Delights, and he says that you were talking about how stories travel, so they have an elsewhere, and that it always means that there's a change that's happened. And Bratcher defines hell as a place without horizon, as a place where there's no alternative that's meaningful, there's no change or elsewhere that's meaningful. And so I think that some of the cynicism that you kind of alluded to in your talk is a sort of earthly brush with the hell that he's talking about. And so many stories these days promise to, I read an ad copy now probably a gazillion times, promise to sort of help us imagine a better future. But it so often feels like it doesn't quite deliver. And so I was wondering if you had either thoughts about why it feels like there aren't meaningful elsewheres in a lot of our stories right now, or stories that you've come across recently that felt like did give you that deep sense of possibility of elsewhere-ness in this world that I think seems so fatigued in its stories because that sense of elsewhere feels so rare. Yeah.
That's a good question.
Thanks.
Do you all know John Bratcher? We're talking about John Bratcher. So the only takeaway from this talk should really be,
go read John Bratcher.
If you've never read John Bratcher, possibly will change your life. Bratcher was I should probably give just a little bit. Bratcher was an art critic. He was an artist by training who then started writing art criticism just for the mainstream British press in London, and started writing novels too, and was wildly successful, won the Booker Prize, sort of like the British Pulitzer, and then got a BBC documentary, Ways of Seeing. And he was a famous public intellectual and novelist at this point, and at that very moment, the kind of pinnacle of his fame, he turned his back on all of it. He did not accept the money for the Booker,
I didn't know that.
and he gave it to the Black Panthers. And then he moved from London to the French Alps to live among peasants for the rest of his life. And the whole time he's writing. That's how he supported them. But there's just an integrity there to that life that is so provocative. So he is someone that I routinely, when I read him, I feel like I'm encountering wisdom that is timeless, but in a way sort of made timeless by that very particular narrative of John Bratcher's life. I'm struck by it. We always want a new solution, right? We want, what's the pill that we can swallow? What's the new technological development? But all these things seem to actually exacerbate the problem. And I'm sure I'm always wanting to find a new book to read that's going to do that. It's going to but oftentimes I have this sensation where then I just start looking around my shelves, and I realize that there's all these books that I haven't read yet that have been there all along. And I think that in some ways that's like a metaphor for the situation. It's like I think that we have it already. It's probably, it could be so simple as put the phone down. Go work somewhere outside outside of your comfort zone for a summer. You know, have a conversation with someone who's older than you. You know, but all of these things are rarer and rarer.
I mean, yeah, it strikes me as true that we're all sort of decrying this, and myself included, decrying this lack of elsewhere. And is it just because we're all in our phone algorithms that spit us back the same things over and over again? So it feels like there's no elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, similarly, I find myself turning back to the classics in that mood. I just read the Iliad this summer. I'd never read it before, and I was like, "This Homer guy, that's pretty good."
Who knew?
I know, who knew? So every English teacher I've ever had for how many years of public schooling? Many.
Or for that matter, the Bible.
It's really good.
I mean, seriously, like I think for many of us, me included, we think we know the Bible.
Oh yeah.
And then you open it and you're like, that doesn't fit the sermon that I heard.
Oh yeah. I mean, I realized I still have, I think, a gap from Mount Sinai to the New Testament. Mm-hmm. I know like bits and pieces in there, but I think that whatever the liturgical cycle of Catholicism just tends to hit those middle books far less frequently. So a lot of those middle ones, I know some of the references and some of the big highlight reels, but that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, but the highlights are highlights because they went through
that
exactly. First.
Yeah. No, for sure. Checks notes. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is kind of related to that. You mentioned this in your talk and in your response to that first question, sort of the feeling that our culture spends less time confronting the inevitability of death, sitting in church pews, for example, sitting in art museums for me, and more time trying to outrun it. How do you see that as also part of this conversation of our sort of story exhaustion and the feeling that we don't know how to interact with stories anymore?
Personally, I find thinking about death regularly sort of just reminding yourself this, by which I gain access to that sort of thought. Wherever we go, whenever we travel to see family, I go to cemeteries. Mm-hmm. It's weird. I know. Emily doesn't go with me. She's not doing the same thing. But we were talking about this last night. There's something about a gravestone, 1932 dash, 1985, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or some of them, the ones that I really like are the ones where it's like the person's still alive, but they already got the gravestone.
Yeah.
It's like born in 1958, and it's just a dash. They're living in the dash.
Right.
Literally,
yes.
right now, they're
yes.
living in the dash. I think that death, for all it's wrong and it's horrible and it hurts and it's not a nice thought and it's shakes you out of your comfort zone and all that sort of stuff, but it's actually a gift. I just don't know how you can be a serious person, how you're not just delusional, if you're not regularly living in light of that reality.
Yeah. I mean, Elie Wiesel said the opposite of life is not death, it's apathy. And I feel like a lot of humans are living in intermittently me as well, living in the apathy. During quarantine, that word languishing got used a lot to describe how people were feeling, that sort of directionless feeling, sort of spiritual decay.
Yeah.
And I think that we do a disservice to ourselves when we mistake the opposite of life as death, rather than death being the thing that defines life.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that it can be liberating, maybe even for an artist, for a writer, but just for anybody, has to do with, well, I'm a Christian. And so right at the core, I think, of my understanding of death is that that's over to God. Right?
Yeah.
If we have not died yet, there's still work to do. There's still things to learn, right? The story's not over yet. And so, in a way, it's sort of go for broke.
Yeah.
You have nothing to fear, ultimately. God, when it's over, he will put that book on the shelf.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Oh, I had another thought, but it went clean out of my mind. I found the tail of it. Let me see if I can wind my way back.
I know the feeling, especially on Saturdays.
Yeah, for real. Another writer I've been thinking a lot about in this particular moment is Viktor Frankl. Have you ever come across Man's Search for Meaning? Oh, it's good. But he was, like Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, I guess would be the more appropriate term. And his whole argument is that the driving, sort of most basic urge in humanity is not pleasure, as Freud thought, is not power, as other psychoanalysts thought, but meaning. That humans will do anything to hold on to the meaning that they feel that they have in our lives. And Frankl argued that one of the things that religion, he was Jewish obviously, but actually talks about Christianity a lot and uses the metaphor of the cross quite a bit. One of the things religion does for us is give our suffering meaning in the absence of anything else. That he's like, religion teaches us that we rise to meet life. Life questions us, not the other way around. And his big contention was that with the sort of culture's disavowal of a lot of tradition and religion, that it's harder to make meaning now, and for him now was, 1970 when the most recent edition of the book came out. But I would say it's only gotten worse since that point. And it feels like a lot of the stories, the sort of grasping at stories that I see in politics, even in advertising, is trying to make meaning of suffering without religion.
Yeah.
That seems like a very tall order, and I don't think that anyone has managed it yet, and I'm not sure it's possible for a secular, increasingly secular culture to do that. So, I find myself turning back to religion here in the fourth decade. And yeah, I never quite found the question back, but we'll see if you have, I'll pitch it over to you and see if you have thoughts.
No, those are profound thoughts.
It's a good book. So, two reading recommendations for this conversation: Drew Bratcher, Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we can turn it out to y'all too if y'all have questions for Drew. Happy to open it up. Or if you want me to, I can, go for it, John.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Frankl and the Man's Search for Meaning, because in my own analysis of story and storytellers and writers, it's if we find a road to meaning and we write it in good craft, good technique, then it seems like we kind of bridge that tiredness that you're talking about. That maybe society or readers have. And I guess what I'm saying, like Frankl, is that there's a ton of search for meaning out there. And we all tap into it because we all have a story that taps into some kind of meaning. But then the craft is, how do I overcome the cell phone and the social media, as was alluded to in yesterday's talk? Well, sure, there's a burden of tiredness and all this stuff going on. I guess that's our challenge as writers, is to say, you know what, look, I've got some really neat things to tell you, or they're this part of me in my life, I'd like to share them. And if we do it in such a way that people dismiss us, of course they're tired.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, I guess, both for teachers of writing and writers.
Yeah, no question. I think I came up in journalism, not writing about myself at all, and then very much fell in love with essays. And I think that my resistance to them originally was, this is selfish. Like, why should anybody listen to anything I have to say? I'm like the least interesting person in every room, And I love that about journalism, that you can tell other people's stories, and I still love that. But my mind has changed about the essay's capacity to be selfless, because I think that by isolating an experience and thinking about it on the page with rigor, in good faith, without cynicism, puzzling over that, trying to put the pieces together, naming things, what you're doing, if you're doing it well, is saying, yeah, this is a story from my life. You have them too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's actually an invitation, you know, to what's possible with storytelling, which in many cases I think is what we need, you know, in this age of disillusionment and distraction. Students are fed up with it. They're addicted, like we all are too. But they're not satisfied.
No, no, they're not.
No. You know, the mental health stuff in my classes, and a lot of it has to do with those devices and that technology and the anxiety they generate.
Yeah. I mean, it's not functioning. I mean, sort of in that vein, to kind of try to triangulate, John, what you were saying as well, there's I guess you would call her a Christian mystic, although she was a Jewish woman who never formally converted, but Simone Weil is wonderful, and she defines grace as the weak call, that which calls to us faintly, whereas all the things of the world call to us strongly. And I think about that reflection that you're talking about, to me, is part of the weak call, whereas the cell phone is such the strong call, the addictive dopamine call.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if part of the writer's job, I think maybe what I'm trying to say is that so much of writing feels like it's trying to compete with TikTok
Yeah.
right now, and that's part of why it feels so exhausting. Whereas the best writing actually is the weak call. Doesn't try to grab your attention with the flash and the stuff, and moves more slowly and leaves that silence that you were talking about with Warren. Yeah. What are some stories where you feel that silence, or you feel like the writing is quiet?
It's a good question. How do you go blank whenever anybody asks you for?
Oh, absolutely. Have you noticed how many times I've gone blank just sitting up here? At least 3 already.
I mean, it feels totally cliche to say it, but you know, when I was here, I took probably the most classes of fiction classes that anybody has ever taken in the NW. I took 3 classes with Marilyn Robinson, and you know, there are pieces by Marilyn that were so utterly foreign to me when I read them. I don't even know what this is. Like, this is thinking. What is this? You know, there is no plot.
Yeah.
This is language doing something biblical or something, and it's affecting me, but I don't understand this. So I think, and then getting to study with her and to hear sort of, okay, here's all of the philosophy, here's all the theology, here's all of the thinking that's behind that, and actually she is making an artistic statement by resisting. Yes, TikTok. For sure.
Yeah.
But also all the other trappings of modernity that sort of rob us from, you know, mining our experience for meaning. James Agee was probably the first, for me, like the gateway drug from journalism into, you know, the literary essay or more sort of performative essay writing, because it was just the way that he brought in a lyric sensibility, even into his journalism. You know, those are 2 that come to mind right away. I read Jamaica Kincaid a lot this past year in teaching creative writing, and I'm nothing like Jamaica Kincaid as a writer. She baffles me, but there's something that she has that I want, and so I keep reading her because I want to be weirder than I am.
Oh yeah.
You know?
I always want to be weirder than I am. Yeah. Circle back to John Berger here for a moment. He defines advertising as that which robs us of our self-worth and gives it back to us for the price of the product. And to me, that seems so opposite to what you were talking about with delight. That to me, when we give someone delight, it's a purely generous. We're not trying to take anything from them. We're just giving.
Yeah.
Writing as offering, I think, rather than argument. And I think it plays into some of the storytelling fatigue that a lot of us are feeling too, but how do you, it's easy even in myself to kind of feel miserly sometimes, with my emotions, with my time. How do you as a writer sort of maintain that feeling of generosity in the midst of all the mania and the bustle, so that you can try to give that delight to a reader?
Yeah. I mean, I think about it as a teacher too. I think, for me, I think that teaching and also being a dad are the two theaters where I'm the most sanctified. And because it is give without expectation of receiving anything back, except maybe apathy or anger. And yet, what's the call? The call is to give it away. You know, so I keep giving it away. Like every semester, we were talking about this earlier too. It's like it has cost me everything to learn this. I have had to suffer. I've had to lose. I've had many sleepless nights, dark nights of the soul, and all the rest. And I'm giving it to you here at the beginning of your journey. You know? But you can't make them do anything with it.
No.
All you can do is share it. And I think, to me, that feels a little bit different than writing. For me, I think writing is much more about me trying to figure out what I think. I just don't ever know what I think.
No.
And so, but writing is the one place where I feel like, okay, there's something about a piece of paper, there's something even about a screen, a computer screen, that this is sort of fixed and this is a safe space for me to just be able to be free to get something in moving and to follow it to a kind of conclusion.
Yeah, for sure.
And you do that too.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I journal every day. I can't, but I don't want to go crazy because I don't know what I think.
Yeah.
I'm just a leaf on the wind blowing through the world.
And I mean, Andy, do you have an essay collection coming one of these days?
Yes, hopefully soon. Actually.
Should have already happened, but I don't run these publishing.
No, I don't either. And it's one of those weird things I'm actually grateful for because the draft that was ready, it turned out is not ready. It's my 25-year-old draft. I just needed to grow up a little bit, but that's fine. Brett, how are we doing on time?
We got about 25 minutes.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
25 minutes?
Yeah, is that too long?
Go for it.
Maybe more like, I don't know, 5 minutes.
Oh.
So I love how you said the opposite of life is not death but apathy. But I was thinking about how Jesus himself often used the contrary to life as being unawakened, right? It's being sleep. And I think we have we can see in Ecclesiastes that life is vanity. And then we can see death in the Christ narrative as the agony that precedes this triumphant victory. But you, in your stories that you gave today, you give us a wrestling of the artist or the poet with the striving against death, not in the martyr sense, nor in the vain sense, but the very human sense. And I'm wondering, where do you in the scriptures find that artistic impulse? Striving against death, to give contours to that, rather than the mere triumphant victory against the cross, or the life is vanity and nothing more. Does that make sense, my question?
Yeah, I mean, I need to think about that more, Phil. That's a good question. My mind immediately goes to, maybe it's not called death, but just, the way that affliction, hardship, trials are regarded, at least in the New Testament writers, as being related to death and as being bad. These are not nice things. These are not good things. But in a spiritual sense, they are necessary things, to teach us about our need for something outside of ourselves, to increase our longing for that place where death does not reign. I'm interested to think about, this is not really a worked out idea yet. I mean, I'm just sort of throwing ideas out there, but if narrative is for this world, this time. Is there another world, another time? I don't know about all that. But Jesus got up from the dead, and he says that his followers will too. You know, we all have to decide whether or not he did that, or if he's just crazy. What does that mean for eternity? Is there narrative in a place where there is no death? Where,
As someone who's about to read Paradiso, that everyone says is the worst book of the Divine Comedy, because it's in paradise. There's not as much drama. There's not as much story, because there's no conflict, right? Yeah, and to your question, when you asked that, the thing that popped into my head is, and this is also a very unthought out idea, so I'm fully ready to retract this upon further consideration, but it strikes me that a lot of artists mentally spend their time in a sort of Garden of Gethsemane space. I don't want this to be the way it is. I don't want this thing to be inevitable, but it is. And I think that's the grappling that of death in this world that I think I feel in a lot of artists' work, is that sort of vigil in Gethsemane space that is neither the cross nor the resurrection, but something just before all of that. Yeah, someone, and then two.
My primary vocation in life right now is to shape and form my children, and I really resonate with trying to get both myself and my kids to hang with the slowness of narrative and be okay with that. I'm interested to know, I'm not sure whether you have kids, Annie, I know you do, Drew, what do you and Emily do, or what are your thoughts about that as it's related to Bucket and Helena and Rosie and Marina? Is that Anna's?
yeah, MJ, Marina Jean. We fail physically at this all the time. Emily would laugh at me giving parenting advice, but we try to do read alouds pretty religiously, you know.
And what are some of the things, do you do classics, do you mix it up?
In the mornings we read a psalm together, and then everybody prays for somebody, and that's all we do in the morning with the kids. This summer we're going to read The Lord of the Rings aloud, at least to the three oldest ones. We think that they can handle it. Emily is really good about finding. She probably even found some from you. I mean, just finding the good read aloud books. And the kids most of the time some people talk about this, they're like, yeah, our kids are so, they're just into it, and it's a really sweet family time. I'm like the cop in the corner being like, sit down. Listen to your mother. It doesn't go very smoothly.
Yeah, no, it doesn't for us either, but I stick with it.
And often it's like, okay, it's done for tonight, go to bed. So the books take a really long time to finish, but
is there something in what they're choosing that gives you a nugget of hope? In terms of what they choose themselves to read.
Yeah, that's true. I think just exposing kids to books is just a good thing to do. All of them, and they go through seasons, but all of them are readers, except for MJ, she's 3.
Yeah.
But she loves to look at the pictures and make up stories, I'd be more interested. You probably have better wisdom on that than me.
Oh.
Annie, do you want to?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I married into 2 step kids, currently 13 and 16. And the 16-year-old...
Lord have mercy.
Oh, I know. And when I came in 12 and 10, and the 12-year-old, the then 12-year-old, now 16-year-old hit puberty hard, man, right during quarantine. Whew. But we were really vigilant about making them read a half hour to an hour every day. We're still in no phones in bedrooms family, which has been intermittently really hard to enforce, but we're still doing it. But I'll be totally honest with you, I can see it in both their attention spans still, that they still have trouble sitting through a movie if we don't tell them to put down their phones actively. They still have trouble getting through a book if we're not sort of keeping on them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel good a lot of the time. It's not like you feel warm and fuzzy as a parent. We feel like the cops a lot. But I think a lot of time where we're telling them, encouraging them to leave phones at home. When we're in Italy this summer, neither of them are going to have cell phone data, so that's going to be a nice little experiment. But yeah, you had a question as well, but I want to make sure we got it.
Yeah. Anytime I hear someone talk about storytelling, I always think of Tim O'Brien's quote, where he says, I wrote it down, hold on. I want you to know why story truth is truer sometimes than the happening truth. A thing may happen and be a total lie. A thing may never happen and be truer than the truth. And I guess I just want to hear your perspective on where you feel truth plays a role in storytelling, especially kind of in this era of misinformation, and how maybe storytelling is filling a gap in this era of misinformation.
Yeah, it's a good question. But do you know that you're talking to two graduates of the nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa, which is notorious, if for nothing else,
Yes.
for maybe the way that it complicates
Yeah.
what we think nonfiction writing can include or do.
Yeah.
And we had some professors who would really sort of say, yeah, the truth, the verifiable fact is malleable and can be changed in pursuit of that poetic truth. You know, that sort of other government or something. And then every variation, you know, so
Oh, yeah.
so some people have certain things that they will do, certain things that they won't do. What do you think about? I'm interested in what you think about
Oh, goodness. I mean, for myself, I had this scary thing happen where when I was sort of experimenting with where my ethics lay in that question, I was writing a story about a time as a teenager when I went to Jerusalem, and just for ease of plot, I changed, was something we did in the morning one day and something we did in the afternoon the next day, and just to make the essay easier, I just moved them into the same day. I cannot for the life of me remember what we did actually that afternoon and that
It's
morning.
replaced it.
It's replaced by the written version. And so it cured me of it. I don't change things anymore as much as I can. You know, based on memory's always malleable, blah blah blah. But I mean, I think that is, to me, it really outlines the risk that we all take when we start playing with things like that. And I think that's where we are with the misinformation stuff right now, which is that, I look at it, a conspiracy theorist, say, and I don't see someone who's been lied to. I see someone who is illiterate, as I think our culture is increasingly becoming, in different types of truth. And they've mistaken the type of truth that we hold inside of ourselves for how we feel about the world around us for the entire world around them. And that there can be truths to how we experience things that are not true in any sort of objective, verifiable sense. I mean, to give you a really specific example, I have a memory of my father saying something to me when I was a child. I wasn't a child, I was maybe a teenager. My dad's favorite question was for my sister and I, what would you do if you won the lottery? And you have to understand, my dad, he's a lovely, lovely man, but he's an Iowa farm boy, and he's not the least bit sexist, I want to be clear, but in a cultural way, he views feminine things as superficial. And I was the very feminine older daughter, and my sister was the very sort of butch, sporty younger daughter. And so my dad always just connected with my sister a little bit more than he did with me. And he asked us, what would you do if you won the lottery? And my sister rattled off all these things that she would, basically the places she would donate it, right? All these things she would donate it to. And then my dad turned to me and said, how would you spend it? And I said, well, I'd do pretty much what Sarah did, except I, reallocated some of the money to different charities and causes based on my own preferences. And I said, but first I'd take $500 and buy myself a really nice dress. And my dad, trying to be funny, I think, said, well, I knew Sarah would donate it to good causes and Annie would spend it on clothes. And I think the objective truth was that he thought he was palling around with me, right? But my experienced truth was that my father thought I was superficial and didn't care about me, and over-exaggerated the differences between my sister and I. And so I think that's the ways that we become illiterate, that we do have a personal truth and an objective truth, and they're not the same. That doesn't make one of them invalid, but we have to recognize the light between them. And I think our current culture is bad at recognizing that light.
Yeah, that's well said. One way that it's helped me think, I came from journalism, so I was always the stick in the mud in the class. Yeah. Even though I think it's interesting, thinking about that and whether or not there are artistic reasons to do certain things. But truth is not equivocal, but it is perspectable. And that's been a helpful dichotomy for me, meaning there is truth, but it looks different depending on where you're standing, what you've been through, what kind of glasses you're wearing, all that sort of stuff. And that's where it gets scary. It's when we no longer think that there is anything out there, that we're all talking about the same thing but differently.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we're not talking about the same thing anymore.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you.
We're essayists. It's never going to be a straightforward.
No, we always gotta take this long meandering journey.
With some personal anecdotes.
I know, it's even in the middle of Annie, the story's going on way too long. You gotta cut it short, girl.
But all this is to say, this is why Annie I can't wait to see her book, and there should be more occasions where you get to do your thing.
I saw another question here.
I really actually want to keep pressing in on that because we're talking to that illiteracy that you're talking about, or information illiteracy, however you want to frame it. But and the way story does play into it, because I think we're talking about story one way as something that is true and humanizing and good and delightful. But there are other stories out there. There are stories that perpetuate monoliths. There are stories that hurt others. There are stories that are untrue that we tell ourselves. So I wonder, I was thinking, Drew, about the two stories you told and the humanizing nature of those stories, right? The first story, and this is just the way I've perceived it, I see potentially a greedy girl who wants something she shouldn't have until I see her pity, until I see her step off that horse. And she is a fuller and more humanized person. Your uncle, you might even say, who you saw as this gruff person to kneel down and speak to his children and go out there for that coyote, humanized him because it was a fuller story, not to be cliche. Everyone talks about this, but it's like, Adichie's super popular TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. We tell ourselves these other narratives too about whole peoples that aren't true and are dehumanizing. So I think as we think about information illiteracy, as we turn to the algorithm, that is telling a story. So as you work with future writers, how would you encourage them to ensure that their stories are humanizing, are delightful in a way that furthers the humanity of other people?
It's a great question. I have the advantage, which I never thought that I would have, of teaching at a Christian school. It's a really strange environment. And I don't fit there in many ways. I didn't go to one. I feel like an outsider. But it is the sort of situation that we found ourselves in, and it's good. There are challenges, formidable, but I think sort of emphasizing in my writing classes a Christian understanding of anthropology is crucial in that. To recognize simultaneously that all human beings are valuable because they are made in something that we might describe as like the image of God, So it's every encounter with a human being is serious, and it's complex. Every human being is simultaneously capable of surprising you in marvelous ways, right? So we're not surprised when human beings do extraordinary things. And some of the most extraordinary is when they're kind unexpectedly, More of that, please, And we're also, as Marilyn said in one of her classes, homicidal maniacs. And both are true.
Yep.
And so we're not surprised when the squad cars pull up at that neighbor's house next door either, you know? But I don't know, I think just having an awareness of that, right? We are good and we are not good. We are empathetic and we are not. You know, we are the opposite. All those sorts of things helps. And then I think, I try in my classes, largely failing, but to encourage the students to write out of their love rather than out of their hate. Because I think that the world that most of the text that is produced in the year 2024 is hateful. We're really well versed in what we don't like or don't understand, you know? And we are not articulate about what we love. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm hoping that by flipping that switch, saying that's a valid thing to write about too, you know, write about your complicated love for something. Because usually they have weird things that they are into, you know, and nobody's ever written about that before that I know of. You like what kind of M&M or, you know, whatever it is. Like, yeah.
No, I completely agree with that, you know, obviously there's a place for diatribes and manifestos. Goodness knows there's been a lot of successful writing done in that mode, but we're just super saturated with it right now. And I think part of it, to tie back to the social media thing, there is a safety in always being the critic. There is a safety in never talking about what you love. If you get in a room of first-year grad students, they'll all critique books. None of them will say which ones they really like because it's scary. And so, yeah, I mean, I tell them in my class, I'm like, there's a place for manifestos and diatribes, but not in this class. You're not going to do it here. You'll get plenty of other spaces to do it. But here, we're going to write about our homes and the complicated things we love about them. We're going to write books about books that we love. And when push comes to shove, I make them choose an audience. If they're going to write persuasively, which as a rhetoric teacher I have to do, I make them choose an audience and write to that audience. Because oftentimes they'll choose a group, political often, that they disagree with, and they'll say, well, I'm going to convince these people. And in the course of writing, they realize they don't even know who they're talking to.
Yeah.
They have no idea. You know, I'll have students, you know, writing about in favor of gun reform, saying, you know, those people care about guns more than children. I'm like, they're gonna read that sentence and close their laptop and never read anything you put to page ever again. So you have to think about how they see themselves and what they actually think. We live in with algorithms, we live in an era of strawman fallacies that nobody even knows are happening. So choosing an audience, researching the audience, writing to that audience, I think can be a fine antidote to some of the things you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really refreshing to hear people kind of talk out against social media. I mean, I'm 22, and if you even bring up anything against like social media or technology, you're seen as a Luddite, and like you're being ridiculous. You're being like my grandpa or whatever. But do you guys think that there's anything salvageable about social media, about technology that maybe we can incorporate some of like these like ideas into? Is there anything good about these algorithms?
So, I mean, I think that is good. It can be good in the way that sugar can be good. or alcohol can be nice on occasion, right? That you have to be judicious. I mean, one of my closest friends right now I met through Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, we wouldn't be friends.
That
probably.
can happen.
That can happen. But the incentives push all the wrong ways. The incentives push us to be outraged, closed-minded, thoughtless, defensive. And so it's a metaphor for life in some horrible ways. In the same way that the incentives are going to go all the wrong way, we have to listen to the weak call. And that's what turns the weapon into a tool, the sword into the plowshare. And then I think it can be great. But the incentives, the winds blow us all the wrong directions.
I'm struck by how just human nature, it just shows up in whatever humans create, you know? I was not on any social media for about a decade, and then when the book came out, they really wanted me to get on something, so I did an Instagram page.
Which is delightful, by the way. It's a delightful.
I just
Instagram.
post poems and pictures of El Caminos. And
Oh, come on, you have a good photography eye.
Thanks. And initially, like when Facebook first came out, do you use Facebook? Does anybody use Facebook anymore? Do you use Facebook?
I don't have any social
Good for you.
media.
Well, I loved just knowing what my old friends were up to. So there was something about you could keep in touch in a way. If you left home, this was a great way to stay in touch with people. Man, it was crazy the way how quickly it became voyeuristic. You know?
yeah.
And I just shut it down after about a year, and I did none for a long time, and I'm thankful for that, you know. But I'm on this Instagram thing now, and I'm really having to watch it because the influence. There's a pull there. There is a pull, like a deep current that's tugging at you. Post something about this when something happens. You know,
Oh, yeah.
promote this, whatever it is, and I don't know. It doesn't make my life better. I don't think. I think it makes me more stressed for sure. I feel it in my shoulders the second I bring it up.
The lactic acid starts to build up. It's like,
But yeah, at its best, I mean, you can still make some human connections, or testify to, you know, a kind of aesthetics, and that can be fun in a season when maybe the writing's not going so well. But why am I? Yeah.
Drew, can you speak a little bit, just to go off like the social media, like how social media, I think, democratizes like storytelling in a way, right? So think of Issa Rae, or think of certain people who wouldn't be found, whose stories wouldn't be heard without social media. So can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think what technology has given us is more voices telling more stories about more things on more platforms, right? That were not available for very bad reasons to a lot of people before the internet and before maybe even social media. That's a good thing. You know, I'm not mad about that at all.
full stop.
At the same time, the technology does cheapen, to a degree, the art. You know, by sort of taking away our ability to pay attention, right? Everything has to be reduced, boiled down, made memeable. And a meme is not going to feed your soul in the middle of the night. You know, it's not something that you'll find coming to your tongue in the middle of a very difficult prayer. It's not something that will orient you necessarily in the midst of a storm, you know.
And I mean, it's notable that the authors that you've mentioned, that their best work, how do I say this? Social media was the springboard, not the thing that they've given us, right?
It's a great place to find
Yeah.
those voices,
Right.
but hopefully,
In the same way that it's a great place to find a friend,
Yeah.
but it's not where the real thing happens. Yeah.
it's the same way with music these days. That's how most of these A&R folks are finding young artists. It's through
Right.
TikTok,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
But once they're found, hopefully,
Right. Yeah.
it's not mainly TikTok anymore.
Exactly. I think the problem happens when we actually, similarly to the illiteracy we were talking about earlier, where we mistake the social media presence for the thing itself, right? It's like the parasocial relationship versus the actual friendship. People who watch someone's TikTok or Instagram or whatever and feel like they know them, but of course they don't. So as long as we keep social media in its proper place as a networking tool, as a way to discover new voices, new people, new storytellers, new artists, A+, carry on humans, we're doing a good job. But we gotta never think that the social media is the storytelling or is the art or
Yeah.
because it is the friendship, it can't be. And if it is, we're lost.
And you can't really have a living or get paid that way, you know, for any, I don't know, it's not sustainable as an artistic sort of career for most people.
For most people.
But you've got a novel coming out in the fall, and you're not on social media.
I'm not.
Are you feeling the pressure to be?
No,
No, okay.
I'm not. I mean, maybe every once in a while, I might feel that pressure, but other artists I've talked to have actually said, do not join social media, right? So I find that really interesting. Like they struggled with either being tagged to bad critiques of their books, you know, like in that way, or just being overwhelmed by social media. So they've actually given me advice not to join. And I don't have pressure from my publisher to join, which I think is a really positive thing as well. But it does make me wonder, who will I be able to reach in this kind of like age of social media, right? Yeah.
Some of the authors that don't use it, they were names before the advent of it, you know, so they don't really need it. They're already ubiquitous somewhat. Think about Zadie Smith or somebody like
Percival
that.
Everett.
Yeah, yeah,
And Tyler, yeah.
yeah, it's tricky.
We have time for one more question.
All right. Let's bring us home.
So something you said about social media made me think of Martin Buber, about like how when you're watching the TikTok or the Instagram, it's like an object. There's a simulacra of something intimate, like an I-you, I-thou relation, but it's really just I-it. You're just objectifying it. How do we get people to introspect in this thing?
How would you compare that to like someone reading a book? So one thing on social media is I'll post something, but I'm not there. I don't know who's looked at it. I usually, you know, I don't really following up on that. But people are having some sort of an exchange.
Yeah.
But there is something similar about a book, like when somebody's reading your book or reading one of your scientific, papers, you're not there.
That's right.
How does that relate?
Like so Buber would say that there's an encounter with the intimacy of your essays, right? Like you encounter a simulacra, but there's a genuine moment of intimacy.
Okay.
There's a moment, but then you put it on the shelf and it's the book. It's no longer the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I have to encounter it. I've got to inhabit it. I've got to, and that takes the patience, right? There's the encounter of the intimacy requires the depth of the soul.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm just posing it.
How do you get people to be introspective though?
Yeah, but to get to the the TikTok is just the simulation. It's you're not relating. There's the lack of the relational, which you alluded to.
Yeah, I wonder if it's actually less about, well, let me see if I can think this through as I'm saying it. There's a way in which, like we were saying before, there's a silence in books. And media overwhelms the senses, that's part of the point. It shuts down the conversations that are happening in our heads. And I wonder if when I encounter someone else in a book, it's actually that it's not that I'm encountering Drew in his essay collections exactly, though I swear I can hear your voice reading the essay.
Yes.
It's that I'm encountering the disregarded, perhaps othered bits of myself that I've swept to the side, that something in Drew's storytelling is bringing out. And so I'm actually learning introspection and empathy as an internal process that allows me to replicate it outwards. Whereas I think social media and media in general shuts down those internal dialogues with its noisiness.
That's good.
Yeah.
Some more reading.
More reading. More reading.
Good reading.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.